The message came through just as I stepped into my car. The sky was still gray from the late morning drizzle, and the scent of hospital antiseptic still clung to my coat. "I didn't sign up for this," the text read. Attached was a screenshot of our joint bank account, balance, 0. I stared at it, numb. My hands were trembling, not because of the diagnosis I'd just received, but because the man who was supposed to be my husband had walked out of my life in a 3-sentence message, and taken every last cent with him. My name is Charlotte Mason. I'm 38. I teach English at a public high school in Portland. And about 30 minutes before that text, a doctor told me I had invasive ductal carcinoma. Stage 2. Aggressive. Treatable, but only if we moved quickly. I remember nodding. Holding it together. Asking practical questions while my heart beat so loudly I could barely hear my own voice. But somehow, his message, hurt more than the words "malignant tumor." The worst part? I wasn't even surprised. Ryan had always been charming in public, presentable, even generous when the world was watching. But at home, for the last year, he'd been more ghost than husband. Business trips, late nights, a second phone he swore was just for work. I didn't want to believe the truth. Not then. But now? Now I was wide awake. I sat there in the driver's seat, watching the rain hit the windshield, remembering the look in my doctor's eyes when he said the word chemo. It was a look of urgency and hope. Hope. That was the word I clung to. Because what Ryan didn't know, what he had never cared enough to ask, was that I'd already started preparing for this storm. Maybe not the cancer. But him? Him, I'd been expecting. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The house was too quiet when I walked in. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that hums with the echo of something missing. Half his closet was empty. Just hangers swinging like they'd been left in a rush. His shaving kit gone. The wedding photo that had sat on the hallway table for 8 years? Missing. In its place was the faint outline of dust where the frame used to be. I didn't cry. Not when I found the envelope from our bank addressed to him, not when I realized he'd cleaned out the account before I even left the hospital parking lot. Not even when I opened the drawer where we kept our passports and saw his was missing. Instead, I put the kettle on. Some people break down in moments like that. Me? I made tea. I sat at the kitchen counter, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and thought about how we got here. We met 9 years ago at a nonprofit gala. He was speaking on corporate giving, I was there as a +1 for a colleague. He spotted me by the hors d'oeuvres table and said, "You look like you'd rather be grading essays than eating canapés." He wasn't wrong. He made me laugh that night. Really laugh. And back then, that felt like enough. By the end of the year, we were married. A modest backyard wedding, my sister playing guitar, his best friend crying harder than I did during the vows. For a while, life was good. We bought the fixer-upper on Maple Street, turned the attic into a reading nook. Every Sunday, we had pancakes and podcasts. He called me Red because of my hair and the way I blushed when he read my old poems. But somewhere along the way, the warmth drained from his eyes. He stopped asking how my day was. Started working later. Started spending weekends away on strategy retreats. I blamed myself at first. Maybe I was too tired, too boring, too ordinary. But I know better now. Because the thing about cancer, it doesn't just strip you bare physically. It peels away the polite lies, the excuses, the masks. And underneath all that, you see people for who they really are. And Ryan? He wasn't a villain. He was something worse. He was a man who mistook comfort for love and obligation for sacrifice. The moment things stopped being easy, he bolted. But I wasn't going to let his cowardice define my story. Because I still had strength. I still had breath. And, most importantly, I had a plan. I just hadn't told anyone about it yet. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of pain, the medication dulled most of that. It was the questions that kept me awake. The whys and hows, the what did I miss, all swirling in the ceiling above me like shadows that wouldn't settle. At 3:17 a.m., I grabbed my laptop and opened a folder I hadn't touched in years. Emergency, just in case. I'd created it back when Ryan and I were first married. A joke, really. A backup plan for a future I never thought I'd need. Inside were copies of everything: our marriage license, property deeds, bank accounts, and most importantly, an old PDF labeled Oregon cabin, undisclosed asset. I clicked. A deed. Purchased under a limited liability company, signed by Ryan. No mention of my name. Bought 2 years ago. My breath caught. The name of the LLC matched the email address I'd once seen flash across his phone, the one he'd claimed was an investment newsletter. He bought a second home. Hid it from me. And never intended to share it. My hand shook as I highlighted the address. The place wasn't just some forgotten vacation spot. It was lakefront property, prime real estate. Worth at least $400,000 in this market. And he never said a word. I stared at the screen and realized, Ryan hadn't just abandoned me. He'd planned it. Quietly, piece by piece, while I packed his lunch and left notes in his coat pocket like a fool. I took a slow breath and whispered into the darkness, "Okay. You wanted war." The next morning, I called Sandra Wu. Sandra had been my college roommate, now one of the sharpest family lawyers in the Pacific Northwest. When she picked up, she didn't even say hello. "I saw the news," she said. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," I replied. "I'm not calling as your friend. I'm calling as your future client." There was a pause. Then she asked, "Do you want revenge or justice?" "Both," I said. Sandra's voice was calm, even. "Then we'll start by getting everything he thought you'd never find. And we'll do it quietly, surgically. The way men like him never expect." I sat back and smiled for the first time in days. This wasn't about getting even. It was about setting things right. And this time I wouldn't be the one blindsided. By the end of that week, I had 3 folders on my desk and a steel resolve I didn't know I possessed. Folder 1, Financial Forensics. Sandra had introduced me to a woman named Priya, a specialist in asset tracing. Within 48 hours, she'd uncovered 4 more accounts under Ryan's name, 2 domestic, 2 offshore. All opened within the last 18 months. All steadily growing thanks to transfers from our joint funds. Folder 2, Medical Documentation. Every test result, every doctor's note, every appointment reminder since the diagnosis. This wasn't just personal, it was ammunition. Because Ryan had left after the diagnosis, and in the eyes of the court, that mattered. Folder 3, Personal Communication. Texts. Emails. Voicemails. One particularly damning message from Ryan to a friend read, "She'll be too weak to fight back. By the time she figures anything out, I'll be long gone." But the real gold came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Sandra and I met in her office, and she handed me a printout. "He filed a transfer of property deed," she said, tapping the page. "Trying to move the Oregon cabin into his brother's name. A common tactic when they think someone's watching." My hands clenched. "He's laundering his own getaway." Sandra nodded. "But here's the kicker, he filed it a day after you were diagnosed." That was all we needed. The next morning, we filed for emergency asset protection with the court. It froze every property and account under Ryan's name. He couldn't sell, move, or touch anything without a judge's order. At 10:14 a.m., Sandra sent him the official notice. By 3 p.m., he called me. I didn't answer. He called again. Then texted, "You've made this messy. It didn't have to be like this." I stared at his words, then typed one sentence in reply, "It was already messy, you just didn't expect me to clean it up." I pressed send. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. Ryan showed up at my door the following Saturday like nothing had happened. He stood there in a navy blazer, not a wrinkle on it, like this was a business negotiation, not the aftermath of betrayal. "Can we talk?" he asked, voice soft, rehearsed. Privately. I let him in. Not because I owed him that, but because I wanted him to see what strength looked like. The real kind. The kind that doesn't flinch anymore. He looked around the living room, eyes landing on the bouquet of lilies on the table, sent by my students after my second round of chemo. I watched him shift uncomfortably, like he'd stepped into a version of my life that didn't include him. Because he had. "I'm sorry," he started. Everything just spiraled. I was scared. "Scared?" I said, tilting my head. "You cleaned out our bank account, Ryan. You tried to move property into someone else's name. That's not fear. That's calculation." He didn't deny it. Instead, he sighed. "Look, I know I handled things badly. But we were falling apart long before your diagnosis. I thought, maybe it was a chance to reset." I laughed. Not loud. Not bitter. Just that quiet, incredulous laugh that happens when you realize someone is truly beyond reaching. "Did you know I kept a journal?" I asked him, stepping into the hallway. I returned with a slim black notebook, setting it down in front of him. "I wrote down every symptom, every doctor's word, every night I threw up while you were working late." He swallowed. Hard. "I'm not the same woman you left, Ryan. And you're not a ghost I'm afraid of anymore." Then I slid an envelope across the table. Inside, a revised divorce settlement drafted by Sandra, now backed by a court injunction. "You can sign this now, or you can drag it through court and let everything, come out. Including the offshore accounts." Ryan stared at the envelope, jaw tight. "You'd really do that?" I met his eyes. "You already did." He didn't sign right then. But I knew he would. Because when people like him realize the person they underestimated is the one holding all the cards, that's when the game changes. And I wasn't playing by his rules anymore. 3 weeks later, I walked into the courthouse wearing the same navy blue dress I wore the day I defended my thesis. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because it reminded me who I was before all this. Sandra met me at the steps, clipboard in hand, hair pulled back tight. "He's here," she said. "And his lawyer looks like he's aged 10 years. Good." We entered the mediation room, where Ryan sat stiffly at the long conference table, flanked by a man in a charcoal suit who avoided eye contact the moment I walked in. Ryan looked up at me for a second, long enough to notice the scarf I wore over my regrowing hair and the calm, grounded way I sat down across from him. Sandra opened her folder and began. "We're proposing a final settlement," she said, voice crisp, firm. "Sarah retains full ownership of the home, is reimbursed for the $45,000 withdrawn from the joint account, and receives half the equity from the Oregon property. In addition, Mr. Campbell will be responsible for all medical expenses incurred during the course of the marriage as outlined in our previous filing." Ryan's lawyer cleared his throat. "We'd like to avoid litigation. My client is willing to cooperate, assuming some discretion is maintained." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Discretion ended the moment Mr. Campbell transferred assets to an undisclosed entity and abandoned his wife during active chemotherapy. Shall I list the names of the reporters who've already contacted my office?" The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Ryan folded his hands. "Fine," he muttered. "We agree." I didn't flinch. I didn't thank him. I simply nodded and signed the document Sandra passed across the table. When I stood up, I looked him in the eye one last time. "You didn't sign up for this," I said, echoing his message to me. But I did. I signed up to survive. To rebuild. To live. And then I walked out of that room with my name, my dignity, and my future. 6 months later, I stood barefoot on the balcony of my new condo, a mug of mint tea warming my hands, the Pacific breeze lifting the loose ends of my hair. Yes, it had finally started to grow back. Short, soft, defiant. Just like me. Below, the city moved on, as it always did. Buses hissed, bikes clattered across the pavement, and somewhere, someone was late for something that felt urgent. But not me. For the first time in a long time, I felt unhurried. Whole. The settlement had gone through without drama after that day. Ryan quietly signed over the Oregon property. The house we once shared was now legally mine, though I chose to sell it. I didn't want walls soaked in memories and betrayal. With the money, I bought this apartment, smaller, simpler, closer to the school where I'd just started teaching again. Returning to the classroom wasn't easy. The kids asked questions I wasn't ready for. Why did your hair look different? Why did you leave? But slowly, gently, I found my rhythm again. We talked about stories, not just ones in books, but the ones we carry. And I learned, kids don't need perfection. They need presence. One afternoon, after a reading circle, a student named Lila slipped me a crumpled note. On it, in wobbly pencil letters, "You're the strongest person I know." I cried in the supply closet that day. Quietly. Thankfully. The nonprofit I'd started, Breakaway, was already helping 6 women going through the same thing I had. Women who'd been left during illness, discarded in their most vulnerable state. We offered legal support, therapy referrals, even care packages with cozy socks and warm soup. I knew what that kind of softness could mean in the middle of survival. As for Ryan? He lost his job after the internal audit. The woman he left me for? She was gone by October. He emailed once, long, apologetic, full of regret and revisionist history. I didn't respond. He'd chosen his exit. I had chosen my beginning. And that made all the difference. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. This story wasn't just about betrayal or loss, it was about reclaiming your power when everything is stripped away. Maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe you know someone who has. If this story moved something in you, I'd love to know what part spoke the loudest. Leave a comment and share your thoughts, I do read them. And if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to True Tales. Tomorrow, we're releasing something incredibly personal, raw, and empowering. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Until next time, remember, sometimes, survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about rising stronger than before.